Surely you can manage 10,000, Emma. We're covering most of it, but everyone needs to chip in for Rachel's special day. My mother's voice came through the phone with that particular blend of casual expectation and veiled demand that I'd learned to recognize over 32 years. And I stood there in my corner office on the 14th floor of Morrison and Associates in Seattle, looking out at the skyline I'd helped shape, feeling 16 years old again. 16, when they'd first told me I needed to start paying rent. $500 a month, due on the first, no exceptions, extracted from my paycheck from Mel's Diner in Portland, where I worked weekend doubles and every weekday evening after school. My hands perpetually smelling of fryer grease and my feet aching in those terrible non-slip shoes. I remembered the confusion more than the anger, the way I'd looked at my father across the kitchen table when he'd explained this new policy, searching his face for some indication that this was temporary, that this was meant to teach me something specific that would have a clear ending point, but finding only a kind of resolute blankness, as if he'd already decided not to engage with my feelings about it. "It's time you learned responsibility," my mother had said, and I'd nodded because I wanted to be responsible, wanted to be good, wanted to earn the approval that seemed to come so naturally to Rachel, my older sister by 2 years, who at 18 was heading off to college with her entire tuition paid, her car insurance covered, her rent and food and books and spending money all flowing from our parents' bank account to hers in an endless, unquestioned stream. I'd told myself then that maybe they were right. Maybe I needed this lesson in financial management. Maybe the difficulty was the point. But standing here now with my mother asking for $10,000 as casually as someone might request a cup of sugar, I felt the full weight of those years pressing against my chest. $10,000 for Rachel's wedding, added to the approximately $48,000 I'd paid in rent from ages 16 to 24. While Rachel had lived at home rent-free until she was 26, and then had her apartment rent paid by our parents for another 2 years after that. The numbers had always been there, solid and undeniable, but I'd spent so long trying not to calculate them, trying not to see the pattern, trying to believe that somehow there was logic to it, fairness hidden somewhere in the equation I just wasn't sophisticated enough to understand. My mother was still talking, mentioning that she and Dad were contributing $50,000 to the wedding, that Aunt Patricia was giving $15,000, that everyone who loves Rachel was helping make her dreams come true. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The first rent payment was due September 1st, 2 weeks after my 16th birthday, and I remember counting out the bills at the kitchen table while my mother watched with her arms crossed. $500 extracted from the $740 I'd earned that month at Mel's Diner, leaving me with $240 that had to cover my school supplies, my clothes, my phone bill, and anything else I might need or want. I'd been working at the diner since July, had saved up a little over $800 by mid-August, with vague dreams of maybe buying a used car eventually, the way Rachel had received a nearly new Honda Civic for her 16th birthday 3 years earlier. But those dreams evaporated the moment my father sat me down and explained that it was time I contributed to the household, that I was becoming an adult, and adults paid their way. Rachel was across the table doing her nails, 18 years old and 2 weeks away from leaving for University of Oregon with every expense covered, and she'd looked up briefly when Dad explained the rent policy, caught my eye for just a second, then returned to painting her nails a shade of pink called ballet slippers. And I'd wondered even then if she felt anything at all about the disparity, if somewhere in her mind she recognized that this was strange, that something about this wasn't quite right. The justification was always the same, delivered in my mother's firm voice that allowed no discussion. "You need to learn responsibility, Emma. You need to understand the value of money." But I was 16 and making $8 an hour plus tips that varied wildly depending on whether I got the breakfast shift or the dinner shift, and $500 felt like an enormous sum. more than half my income disappearing on the first of every month while I watched my parents pay for Rachel's sorority dues, her textbooks, her meal plan, her spring break trip to Cancun with her roommates. I tried to understand it, tried to see the lesson I was supposed to be learning, but all I felt was confused and hurt and increasingly aware that I was being held to a different standard than my sister, though I couldn't articulate why or even fully acknowledge it to myself, because that would mean accepting that my parents treated us fundamentally differently, and I wasn't ready to accept that yet. I wanted to believe there was logic to it, that maybe they saw something in me that required this particular kind of toughening, some resilience they were trying to build that Rachel didn't need. But even as I told myself these stories, I knew they didn't quite make sense. Knew that charging a teenage girl working part-time $500 monthly while fully supporting her older sister through college wasn't about teaching responsibility so much as it was about something else entirely. Something I didn't yet have the emotional vocabulary to name. College was supposed to be different, supposed to be the place where I could start fresh and build something of my own, but the pattern followed me to Portland State University, where I enrolled at 18 with a partial academic scholarship that covered about 40% of my tuition, leaving me to cover the rest through student loans and whatever I could earn working two jobs. I worked breakfast and lunch shifts at a cafe near campus called The Grind, making lattes and breakfast sandwiches from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, then went to classes until 6, then worked evening shifts 3 nights a week at a bookstore doing inventory and helping customers, getting home around 11 to study until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. Rachel had graduated from University of Oregon the previous spring, walking across that stage debt-free with our parents beaming in the audience, her entire 4 years funded by them down to her sorority dues and her spring break trips and her spending money for weekend shopping trips to Portland. During summer breaks when I came home to Portland, I still paid rent, $500 a month extracted from my paychecks even though I was only there for 3 months, and spent most of my time working, barely using the house except to sleep. But my father said the room was mine whether I was using it or not, so the rent was due, no exceptions, no adjustments for the fact that I was a college student trying to minimize debt while my sister had been given everything freely. I remember specifically the fall of my sophomore year, September 2009, when I went to my parents and asked if they could help me with textbooks, because my architecture program required specialized materials that cost over $800 that semester, books I absolutely needed and couldn't find used, and I'd done the math and realized I'd have to put them on a credit card and go into higher interest debt if I couldn't find another solution. My mother was in the kitchen when I asked, and she'd looked at me with this expression of mild annoyance, as if I'd requested something unreasonable. And she'd said, "Emma, we've talked about this. You need to learn to manage your money better. We can't keep bailing you out." I'd stood there feeling my face get hot because they'd never bailed me out, not even once, but I didn't say that because I'd learned that arguing didn't change anything. It only made them more entrenched in their positions. 2 days later, I was home briefly between shifts, and I saw Rachel in the living room unboxing a new laptop, a top-of-the-line MacBook Pro that cost around $3,000. And when I asked about it, Rachel said casually that Mom and Dad bought it for her because her old laptop was getting slow, and she needed something reliable for her new job in marketing that she'd started the month before. A job that paid $45,000 a year and came with benefits. I did the math silently. They wouldn't give me $800 for required textbooks, but they'd spent $3,000 on a laptop for Rachel, who had a full-time job and could have bought it herself. And something shifted in me that day. Some recognition that this wasn't about teaching me responsibility or helping me grow stronger. This was simply about the fact that they treated us differently, valued us differently, saw us through completely different lenses that I didn't understand and couldn't change no matter how hard I tried to be good, to be responsible, to earn the kind of casual generosity they extended to Rachel without her even having to ask. The disparity followed me into my 20s, like a shadow I couldn't shake, becoming more visible and somehow more painful as I tried to build an adult life, while Rachel seemed to glide effortlessly through hers with our parents' financial support cushioning every step. When Rachel moved out at 26 into a beautiful one-bedroom apartment in the Pearl District with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows, our parents paid her rent for the first year, $1,700 monthly that they justified as helping her get established, though she'd been working full-time for 3 years by then and making decent money in marketing. I'd moved out at 22 immediately after graduation, found a tiny studio apartment in a less desirable neighborhood, and paid every cent of my own rent while simultaneously making loan payments on my $60,000 in student debt. Never once asking my parents for help because I'd learned that help wasn't something extended to me, wasn't part of whatever equation they used to decide who deserved support and who needed to struggle alone. But it was my wedding that finally cracked something open inside me, made the favoritism so undeniable that I could no longer explain it away or rationalize it or pretend it was somehow fair. I met Daniel in 2015 when I was 26, working as a junior architect at Morrison and Associates, and he was a structural engineer consulting on one of my early projects, and from our first conversation, I felt seen in a way I'd never experienced before, like he was genuinely interested in my thoughts and my ideas and my dreams without comparing them to anyone else's or finding them somehow lacking. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, and I was happier than I'd ever been, planning our wedding with a budget of $15,000 that we'd saved ourselves, determined to have a beautiful day without going into debt. When I told my parents we were engaged, my mother's first question was, "When is Rachel going to find someone?" Which should have told me everything I needed to know, but I pushed past it, hopeful that maybe my wedding would be a chance for them to show up for me the way they showed up for Rachel constantly. They contributed $2,000, presented to me with my father saying, "We hope this helps a little." And it did help. I was grateful for it. But I also couldn't help noticing that $2,000 was less than Rachel's monthly rent that they were covering, was a fraction of what they'd spent on her laptop or her sorority dues or any number of other things they'd given her freely over the years. The wedding was small and lovely, held at a vineyard outside Portland with 80 guests, and my parents left the reception at 9:30 because they had an early morning. Though I'd later learn they had no particular plans the next day, they simply hadn't wanted to stay. Daniel's parents, in contrast, were there until the last song played, helping us clean up and pack gifts into our car, his mother hugging me tight and saying, "Welcome to our family, Emma. We're so lucky to have you." And I'd cried in the car on the way to our hotel because I'd never heard my own mother say she felt lucky to have me. Daniel noticed everything, the way my parents barely participated, the disparity in their contribution versus what they'd spent on Rachel over the years, the casual dismissal of our joy, and he started asking me questions gently over the months that followed. "Why do they treat you this way?" he'd ask. And I'd make excuses, defend them, say things like, "They're just used to helping Rachel more because she needs it," or "They're doing their best," or "It's complicated." But Daniel would listen patiently and then ask another question. "But why did Rachel need $1,700 a month when she had a job?" Or, "Why couldn't they stay at your wedding until the end?" His family's reaction when they heard stories about the rent I'd paid as a teenager, about the textbook incident, about the laptop versus my request for help, was shock, followed by visible anger on my behalf. His father saying bluntly, "That's not normal, Emma. That's not how parents should treat their children." And slowly, painfully, I began to accept that maybe he was right. What's strange about success is how invisible it can be to people who've decided not to see you, and by the time I reached 32 years old, I'd built a career that would have made any parent proud, rising to senior architect at Morrison and Associates with a salary of $180,000 annually, leading major civic projects that shaped Portland's skyline. But my parents had no idea because they'd never asked, and I'd stopped trying to tell them. They still thought I was a struggling junior designer barely making ends meet. an image frozen in their minds from years ago that they'd never bothered to update because updating it would have required actual interest in my life, actual questions about my work, actual attention paid to my answers instead of polite noises, before redirecting the conversation back to Rachel. I remember the exact moment I stopped sharing my achievements with them, December 2018. 3 years ago, when I'd been promoted to senior architect at 29, the youngest person at Morrison and Associates to reach that level in 15 years. And I'd called my mother excited to share the news, barely getting through the sentence, "Mom, I got promoted to senior architect," before she'd interrupted with, "That's nice, honey. Did you hear Rachel is thinking about getting a cat? She's been sending me pictures all week of the cutest little tabbies." I'd stood there in my office overlooking the city, phone pressed to my ear, feeling the familiar deflation as my mother talked for 20 minutes about Rachel's potential pet adoption, never circling back to my promotion, never asking what it meant or what projects I'd be leading, or how I felt about this achievement I'd worked toward for 7 years. After that call, I made a decision that felt like self-preservation. I would maintain contact because they were my parents, and some part of me still hoped for connection. But I would stop offering up pieces of my success to be ignored or minimized, or used as a transition point to talk about Rachel. Daniel and I had moved to Seattle a few months before that, partly for his job, but partly, if I'm honest with myself, to create physical distance that matched the emotional distance I'd been feeling for years. And the 3-hour drive between Seattle and Portland became a protective buffer that made everything easier. Our contact settled into a pattern of bi-weekly phone calls that I initiated out of obligation, 45-minute conversations where my mother talked about Rachel's work projects, Rachel's apartment redecorating, Rachel's new boyfriend, Rachel's thoughts on various restaurants and television shows and political issues, occasionally asking me, "And how are you?" in a tone that expected a brief, positive response before we moved on to more important topics. I'd say, "I'm fine, work is busy," and she'd say, "That's good," and then launch into another Rachel story, and I'd sit there feeling like a supporting character in my own family, present but not really seen, acknowledged but not truly known. My career flourished in this invisibility, ironically freed from seeking their approval. I threw myself into my work and excelled, leading the design team for the Portland Civic Center renovation project worth $50 million, winning the National Architecture Award in 2020, being featured in Architectural Digest, building a reputation in the Pacific Northwest architecture community as innovative and talented. But my parents knew none of this because knowing it would have required them to ask, to listen, to see me as someone worth paying attention to, instead of the responsible one who didn't need their focus, because Rachel needed it more. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2021, while I was in a design meeting reviewing structural plans for a new mixed-use development in downtown Seattle, my phone vibrating insistently, until I excused myself and stepped into the hallway to see my mother's name on the screen. And when I answered, she launched immediately into the reason for her call without asking how I was or what I might be doing. "Emma, we need to talk about Rachel's wedding," she said in that brisk tone she used when discussing logistics, treating me like a task to check off her list rather than her daughter. "Your father and I are contributing $50,000, which is covering the venue and catering, and your Aunt Patricia is giving $15,000 for flowers and photography, but there are still expenses that need to be covered, and we're asking family members to chip in." I'd known Rachel was engaged, had received a brief text about it 6 months earlier, but this was the first I'd heard about specific wedding plans or any expectation of my involvement. "How much are you thinking?" I asked carefully, already bracing myself because with my family, the asks were never reasonable, never proportional to what they'd given me, always operating under the assumption that I had resources to spare, despite never asking if that was actually true. My mother didn't hesitate, didn't soften the blow, just stated it as fact. "We'd like you to contribute $10,000. The wedding budget is $75,000 total, and everyone needs to chip in to make Rachel's day perfect." $10,000. I stood there in the hallway of my firm's offices, looking out at the Seattle skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, and felt the number land in my chest like a stone. 10,000, I repeated, making sure I'd heard correctly. Well, Rachel is the bride, Emma. This is her special day. Surely you can manage 10,000. We're covering most of it, but everyone needs to chip in, my mother continued, and I could hear her moving around her kitchen, the familiar sounds of dishes clinking, suggesting she was multitasking during this conversation, not even giving it her full attention, despite asking me for more money than most people spend on a used car. I thought about my own wedding 3 years earlier, the $15,000 budget Daniel and I had scraped together ourselves. The $2,000 my parents had contributed with an air of generosity, as if they'd given me something substantial. I thought about Rachel living rent-free until she was 28, while I'd paid $500 monthly, starting at 16. That's a lot of money, Mom. I need to think about it, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, and then her tone shifted to disappointment, edged with accusation. I suppose we shouldn't be surprised. You've always been selfish with money, Emma. Ever since you were young, always holding on to every penny instead of being generous with family. Selfish. The word hit me like a slap, particularly cruel coming from a woman who'd watched me work double shifts as a teenager to pay rent. She'd never charged my sister, who'd contributed a fraction to my wedding compared to what she was now spending on Rachel's, who'd paid Rachel's rent for a year while I'd struggled alone. I ended the call moments later with a non-committal promise to think about it, my hands shaking as I stood in that hallway, and when I returned to the conference room, I couldn't focus on the structural plans spread across the table because my mother's words kept echoing in my mind. The casual cruelty of being called selfish by someone who'd watched me pay $48,000 in rent over 8 years while my sister paid nothing, who'd contributed $2,000 to my wedding while planning to spend $50,000 on Rachel's, who'd helped Rachel with car payments and insurance and rent and countless other expenses while I'd struggled alone through every financial challenge I'd faced since I was 16 years old. I made it through the rest of the meeting on autopilot, nodding at appropriate moments and signing off on decisions I'd barely processed. And when I finally got home that evening, Daniel took one look at my face and asked what was wrong, and everything poured out in a torrent of words I couldn't contain anymore. We sat at our kitchen table as I told him about the call, about the $10,000 demand, about being called selfish, and I watched his expression shift from concern to disbelief to anger on my behalf. The kind of protective anger that comes from loving someone and watching them be mistreated. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly, pulling out his phone and opening the calculator app. "They charged you $500 a month in rent starting when you were 16. You lived at home until you were 24, so that's 8 years. But you were away at college most of that time, so let's say you paid rent for summers and breaks, roughly 4 months a year, plus the 2 years after college when you lived there full-time while saving for our apartment." He was doing the math as he spoke, and I watched the numbers accumulate on the screen. 4 months a year for 4 years of college is 16 months, plus 24 months after graduation. That's 40 months total, times $500, that's $20,000 right there. But you also paid rent during your senior year of high school and the summer after, so add another 8 months, that's $4,000 more. Emma, you paid them at least $24,000, and that's a conservative estimate. I shook my head, remembering more clearly now. I paid more than that. I lived at home my entire first year of college because I couldn't afford dorms, and I paid the full $500 monthly that year. And the summer after sophomore year, I took extra shifts and stayed home to save money, paid rent those months too. I think it's closer to $48,000 total over those 8 years. Daniel stared at me, and I could see him processing this information, calculating what that money could have meant to a teenager and young woman trying to build a life. $48,000. Rachel paid zero. Your parents contributed essentially nothing to your wedding, but they're dropping $50,000 on Rachel's. And now they want $10,000 more from you and call you selfish when you hesitate. He reached across the table and took my hand. Maybe it's time they knew the truth about what you've accomplished, Emma. Maybe it's time they understood exactly who they've been dismissing all these years. I pulled my hand back, feeling defensive in a way I hated, protective of parents who'd never protected me. What's the point, Daniel? They'll just find a way to dismiss it, to make it smaller than it is, to redirect the conversation back to Rachel like they always do. Telling them I'm successful won't change anything. But even as I said the words, I felt something shift inside me, a seed of possibility taking root. Because part of me wanted them to know, wanted them to see what they'd missed while they weren't paying attention, wanted them to understand that the daughter they'd treated as less than had become someone remarkable despite their neglect, rather than because of their support. The week after that conversation with Daniel was when the memories started flooding back in full force, not just the financial disparities I'd already cataloged, but the deeper emotional wounds that money had only been a symbol of. The moments when my parents' differential treatment had cut so deep, I'd learned to bury the pain rather than examine it too closely. I remembered my college graduation from Portland State in June 2011. How proud I'd felt walking across that stage, knowing I'd paid for most of it myself, despite the crushing loan debt. How I'd looked out into the audience and seen my parents sitting there and felt a momentary surge of gratitude that they'd come, only to watch them slip out halfway through the reception because they needed to get to Rachel's boyfriend's birthday party across town. A casual, "Congratulations, honey, we're so proud," tossed over their shoulders as they left me standing there with Daniel, who'd driven down from Seattle, where he was working his first job out of college. And I'd told him it was fine, they had other obligations. But he'd looked at me with such sadness and said, "Emma, this is your college graduation. That should be the obligation that matters." I remembered the miscarriage in February 2019. 3 months into a pregnancy Daniel and I had been cautiously excited about. The devastating cramping that had sent me to the emergency room at 2 in the morning, the lonely hospital room where I'd lost a baby I'd barely begun to imagine as real, and calling my mother the next day once I could speak without crying, telling her what had happened and hearing her say, "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry, but I'm completely swamped at work this week. I just can't get away." Yet 2 months later, she'd taken 2 full weeks off work to stay with Rachel after Rachel had her wisdom teeth removed, posting Facebook photos of the care packages she'd assembled and the movies they'd watched together, captioning them, "Taking care of my baby girl," while I'd recovered from my loss alone, except for Daniel, who'd used all his vacation days to stay with me. I remembered the Architecture Awards ceremony in November 2019, the Pacific Northwest Design Excellence Award for a community center I'd designed in Tacoma, one of my first projects as senior architect and a genuine honor in the regional architecture community. And inviting my parents 6 weeks in advance, sending them the formal invitation, and following up with texts and calls, only to have them decline 3 days before the event, because "Portland is so far, Emma. It's a 2-hour drive and your father's back has been bothering him." This from parents who'd driven 6 hours each way every other weekend to visit Rachel during her 4 years at the University of Oregon, who'd attended every one of her college theater performances, even the ones where she'd played non-speaking background roles, who'd never once suggested that distance was a barrier when it came to being present for their golden child. The memories accumulated like evidence in a trial I'd been building against myself for years, each one a data point I'd previously interpreted as proof of my own inadequacy, my own failure to be worth their time and attention and presence. But Daniel's words kept echoing in my mind, suggesting a different interpretation entirely. That perhaps the problem wasn't that I was unworthy of their support, but that they'd been incapable of seeing my worth clearly, blinded by whatever psychological mechanism had designated Rachel as deserving and me as expendable. The decision crystallized 3 days later when the wedding invitation arrived in a heavy cream envelope with Rachel's and her fiancé Marcus's names embossed in elegant gold script, and I opened it standing in our Seattle apartment's entryway, still wearing my coat from work, pulling out the formal invitation with its tissue paper overlay and response card. And there, beneath the request for the honor of my presence at the ceremony, I found a second card listing the wedding party, and my name was printed there under bridesmaids without anyone having asked me, without a phone call or text, or any acknowledgement that being in someone's wedding party is something you request rather than demand. And I felt something inside me go very still and cold. I texted Rachel immediately asking about bridesmaid expectations, and her response came back within minutes with a link to a dress that cost $400, details about a bachelorette party weekend in Napa Valley that she estimated would cost around $1,500 per person for the hotel, and planned activities, and a reminder that Mom had already mentioned the $10,000 contribution they were hoping I'd make. And I stood there doing math that made my stomach turn because this wasn't just about money anymore, but about the casual assumption that I existed to serve Rachel's needs, that my resources and time and presence were simply available for the taking, without reciprocation or appreciation or even basic courtesy. I thought about my own 30th birthday 6 months earlier, which Rachel had forgotten entirely until I'd mentioned it on a phone call 3 days after the fact, her distracted, "Oh God, I'm so sorry. Work has been crazy," doing nothing to soften the hurt of realizing my own sister hadn't remembered or cared enough to send even a text message, and now she expected me to spend nearly $12,000 celebrating her, to smile and wear the dress she'd chosen, and perform the role of supportive sister in a relationship that had only ever moved in one direction. When Daniel came home that evening, I told him I wasn't going to attend, that I was done performing in this theater of family obligation, and I waited for him to agree or perhaps to tell me I was being too harsh. But instead, he sat down across from me at our kitchen table and said something I hadn't expected. "What if you did go, but you let the truth come out naturally? Not making a scene, not confronting anyone, just being honest about your life when asked, letting people see who you actually are instead of hiding to avoid outshining Rachel." I stared at him, processing the suggestion that felt both terrifying and liberating. "You mean stop pretending to be less successful than I am?" He nodded slowly. "I mean stop protecting people who've never protected you, and let them finally see what they've been missing while they weren't paying attention." We stayed up late that night formulating a plan that wasn't about revenge but about truth, about showing up as my full self rather than the diminished version I'd learned to perform around my family. And for the first time in my life, I felt something shift from resignation to possibility. I sent the RSVP card back 2 days later with both our names marked under "accepts with pleasure," a phrase that felt ironic given my actual emotional state. And I ordered the $400 bridesmaid dress in the size Rachel had specified without asking what I actually wore. And I began preparing mentally for the Napa bachelorette party weekend while simultaneously arranging my work schedule to accommodate these obligations I'd committed to, despite their cost, both financial and emotional. The bridesmaid dress arrived in early July and hung in my closet like a monument to enforced participation, a shade of dusty rose that Rachel had chosen because it complemented her coloring without considering whether it worked for anyone else. And every time I saw it, I felt that mixture of resentment and resignation I'd become so familiar with over 32 years of being the accommodating daughter. It was during this preparation period, while I was reviewing my investment portfolio to see what I could liquidate to cover the bachelorette party expenses without touching my primary savings, that my Aunt Patricia called, my mother's younger sister, who'd always been warmer to me than my parents, but who lived in Boston and thus had limited exposure to the daily dynamics of our family's dysfunction. She'd called to ask about wedding logistics since she was flying in for the ceremony, and somehow the conversation turned to the bachelorette party costs. And I mentioned casually that I was shuffling some investments around to free up the cash I'd need for the weekend, a comment I made without thinking about how it might sound to someone who didn't know about my financial situation. "Investments?" Patricia said, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice rather than the dismissive tone my mother would have used. "I didn't realize you were doing well enough to have an investment portfolio, Emma. Your mother always makes it sound like you're just getting by." Something in her tone, that authentic interest I so rarely heard from my family, made me pause, and I realized this might be the first crack in the wall of silence I'd built around my professional success. "I'm doing okay," I said carefully, testing the waters. "Work has been good lately." Patricia asked what I did exactly, and I felt that familiar hesitation, the learned behavior of making myself smaller. But then I remembered Daniel's words about letting the truth emerge naturally, and I took a breath and told her. I was a senior architect at Morrison and Associates in Seattle. I'd recently been promoted to lead designer on a $50 million civic center project, and I'd been with the firm for 8 years, working my way up from junior designer to one of their youngest senior architects. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough that I wondered if the connection had dropped, and then Patricia said in a voice filled with something between shock and outrage, "Does your mother know this? Does she know what you've accomplished?" I felt my throat tighten because the answer was complicated, layered with years of attempted sharing and systematic dismissal. "I've tried to tell her," I said quietly. "She doesn't really listen." Patricia made a sound that was half laugh and half something darker. "Emma, your mother told me last month that you were still struggling as a junior designer at some small firm, that she worried about whether you and Daniel were making ends meet." The fact that my own mother had been spreading a narrative of my supposed failure while remaining completely ignorant of my actual success should have hurt more than it did, but instead, I just felt tired and strangely vindicated, as if Patricia's shock was confirming something I'd always known but couldn't quite articulate, that my invisibility in my family wasn't about my worth, but about their willful blindness. The bachelorette party weekend arrived in late July, when Napa Valley was at its most beautiful and most expensive, and I flew down to San Francisco with Daniel, who'd planned to visit a college friend in the city, while I participated in 3 days of celebrating my sister's upcoming marriage. And I rented a car and drove north through golden hills dotted with vineyards to the boutique hotel Rachel had selected, where rooms cost $350 per night. And from the moment I arrived in the lobby with its carefully curated, rustic, elegant aesthetic, I could feel myself shifting into the role I'd perfected over decades. The accommodating younger sister who took up minimal space and caused no disruptions. There were 8 bridesmaids total, including me, most of them Rachel's college friends or colleagues from the marketing firm where she worked, and they greeted me with the kind of vague politeness people reserve for acquaintances they don't quite remember. And I realized that Rachel had apparently never talked about me enough for these women who were supposedly her closest friends to have formed any clear picture of who I was beyond the sister. We had lunch on the hotel's terrace overlooking the valley, and the conversation flowed around me in waves of wedding planning details and reminiscences about shared experiences I hadn't been part of. And when Rachel's maid of honor, Jessica, asked me what I did for work, I saw Rachel's slight wince before I could even answer, as if my profession was something embarrassing she'd rather not acknowledge. "I'm an architect," I said simply, and Jessica nodded with polite disinterest and said, "Oh, that's nice. Do you draw houses?" And I felt the familiar sting of being reduced to a child's conception of my profession, but I just smiled and said something non-committal about working on various buildings. Rachel jumped in quickly with, "Emma's always been good with her little drawings," in a tone that was meant to sound affectionate but landed somewhere closer to patronizing. And one of her other friends, Lauren, made a joke about whether I was still playing with buildings, or if I'd moved on to actual adult work, and the table laughed in that casual way people do when they don't realize they're being cruel. And I took a sip of my overpriced wine and reminded myself that I'd chosen to be here, that this was part of letting the truth emerge naturally, even if the emergence was more painful than I'd anticipated. The afternoon continued with a wine tasting tour that cost $120 per person, and during the drive between wineries, the conversation turned to careers and money in the way it does among 30-something professionals who are simultaneously proud of and anxious about their accomplishments. And I listened as Jessica talked about her recent promotion to marketing director and Lauren complained about her salary as a pharmaceutical sales rep. And then one of the other bridesmaids, a woman named Madison, with sharp features and intelligent eyes, asked me which firm I worked for in Seattle. I hesitated for just a moment, feeling that familiar pull to diminish myself. And then I thought about Daniel's words and Patricia's shock, and the years I'd spent hiding to avoid outshining Rachel, and I said clearly, Morrison and Associates. And I watched Madison's eyes widen in recognition. The Morrison and Associates? She said, leaning forward with sudden intense interest. The firm that just won the AIA Gold Medal? You work there? I nodded, feeling the attention of the car shift toward me in a way that felt both validating and uncomfortable. I'm a senior lead architect there, I said, keeping my tone casual, and Madison's face transformed into something like awe, mixed with professional respect. And she said, I'm an architect too, at Berkshire Design, and Morrison is legendary. I applied there 3 times and never even got an interview. How long have you been there? In the rearview mirror, I could see Rachel's face, confusion mixed with something that looked like annoyance, as if my professional success was a surprise party she hadn't approved and didn't particularly want to attend. Madison turned out to know exactly who I was professionally, even if she'd never met me personally. And when she pulled out her phone and showed the rest of the car the Architectural Digest feature from 8 months ago that had profiled the Portland Civic Center project with a full photo spread and a 3-page article that included my name prominently as lead designer, I watched the entire dynamic in the vehicle shift like a kaleidoscope turning to reveal a completely different pattern. She asked me specific technical questions about the cantilevered observation deck and the sustainable water reclamation system we'd integrated into the design. Questions that demonstrated she actually understood the complexity of what we'd accomplished. And I found myself answering with genuine enthusiasm, because it was so rare to talk to someone who comprehended the intricacies of structural engineering married to aesthetic vision. And for a few minutes I forgot to make myself smaller and just existed as the professional I'd worked so hard to become. Rachel's voice cut through my explanation of the load-bearing calculations with an edge I recognized from childhood, that particular tone she used when she felt attention sliding away from her toward me, and she said with forced lightness, "Can we not talk about work? This is my weekend, and I'd really rather focus on celebrating my wedding instead of discussing Emma's little building projects." And the word little landed like a slap, even though I should have been immune to that particular diminishment by now. But Madison wasn't deterred, and I saw something in her face that looked like offense on my behalf. And she said with the authority of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about, "Rachel, Morrison and Associates is one of the top 5 architecture firms in the country. They only hire from the absolute best candidates from the best programs, and reaching senior level there before 40 is virtually unheard of." And then she turned to me and asked how old I was, and when I said 32, her expression shifted into something like awe mixed with professional envy, and she said, "That's extraordinary. I'm 34 and I'm still mid-level at my firm, and Berkshire is no small operation." The other bridesmaids were paying attention now, their phones out and searching for the Architectural Digest article, and I could hear their murmured surprise as they looked at the photos of the building I'd poured 3 years of my life into creating. And Jessica said with a note of confusion in her voice, "Emma, why didn't you mention you designed this? I drive past this building twice a week. It's the most beautiful thing in downtown Portland." And I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, because how could I explain that I'd tried to mention it, that I'd learned over decades that my accomplishments were best kept quiet because they made other people uncomfortable, that my family had trained me so thoroughly to diminish myself that it had become an automatic response. Rachel was visibly annoyed now, her face flushed with something between embarrassment and anger, and she made a comment that was meant to sound like a joke, but had venom underneath, saying, "Well, Emma always was good at making little projects seem important. She could make a drawing of a doghouse sound like the Sistine Chapel." And the car went quiet in that way spaces do, when someone has said something cruel enough that even casual acquaintances recognize the toxicity. and I felt Daniel's words in my head about letting the truth emerge naturally. And I realized this was the emergence, messy and uncomfortable, and completely outside my control. And all I had to do was sit with it and let other people see what had been hidden for so long behind my family's willful blindness. Madison's voice cut through the uncomfortable silence with a clarity that felt like a bell ringing in a chapel, and she said with unmistakable firmness, "Rachel, your sister designed the Portland Civic Center. It won the National Architecture Award last year. It was a $50 million project that's been featured in every major architecture publication in the country." And the car went completely silent, in a way that felt suffocating, as if all the oxygen had been suddenly removed and we were suspended in airless space. I watched Rachel's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked uncomfortably like embarrassment. And she turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read and said, "What? Emma, you never said anything about winning a national award." And I felt something crack open inside my chest, not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted sadness. And I said quietly, "I did, Rachel. At Christmas 2 years ago, when the award ceremony happened, I tried to tell you about it, and you were on your phone the entire time I was talking. And then when I finished, you asked me if I thought your boots looked good with your dress." The truth of that memory hung in the air between us, and I could see her trying to remember, her face showing that particular frustration people display when they're confronted with their own thoughtlessness and don't want to admit they weren't paying attention. And she said defensively, "Well, you should have told me it was important. You always downplay everything." Which was such a perfect encapsulation of our entire dynamic that I almost laughed. The way I'd been trained to minimize my accomplishments so thoroughly that when I did exactly that, I was blamed for not making myself impossible to ignore. Jessica jumped in with a kind of awkward enthusiasm, clearly trying to smooth over the tension, saying something about how amazing it was that I'd accomplished so much, and wasn't it wonderful that Rachel had such a talented sister? But her words felt hollow because they were coming too late and for the wrong reasons, motivated by social discomfort rather than genuine interest in who I actually was. The rest of the drive to the next winery was strained, and Rachel stopped participating in the conversation entirely, staring out the window with her jaw set in that way I remembered from childhood when she didn't get her way, and I felt the familiar pull to apologize, to make myself smaller again, to soothe her discomfort at my expense. But I resisted because Daniel's voice was in my head reminding me that I had nothing to apologize for, that my existence and my success were not offenses that required contrition. The remainder of the bachelorette party weekend continued in that awkward vein, with the other bridesmaids now treating me with a kind of confused respect, while Rachel maintained a cool distance that felt like punishment. And by the time I drove back to San Francisco on Sunday afternoon, I was emotionally exhausted from the effort of simply existing authentically in my sister's presence, without performing the diminishment she'd come to expect and apparently require from me. Madison found me before I left and pulled me aside in the hotel lobby, and she said with genuine compassion in her eyes, "I had no idea your own sister didn't know about your success. That's absolutely insane, and I'm sorry if I made things weird by bringing it up, but honestly, I was just shocked that she was treating you like you were nobody when you're literally one of the most accomplished architects in our generation." And I found myself tearing up at her kindness because it had been so long since anyone in my family had acknowledged that there was something fundamentally wrong with how invisible they'd made me feel. Wedding week arrived with the kind of gray Portland drizzle that felt appropriate for my mood, and Daniel and I drove down from Seattle on Thursday afternoon, so we'd be there in time for the rehearsal dinner that evening at some upscale restaurant Rachel had chosen in the Pearl District, the kind of place with exposed brick and Edison bulbs and a prix-fixe menu that cost more per person than I used to make in a week at Mel's Diner. We checked into our hotel, and I changed into the dress I'd bought specifically for this dinner, navy blue and appropriately formal, and I felt Daniel's hand on my shoulder as I stood in front of the mirror, and he said quietly, "You okay?" And I nodded, even though I wasn't sure that was true. The restaurant was beautiful and full of family I hadn't seen in months or years. Cousins and aunts and uncles and Rachel's future in-laws. And when we arrived, my mother directed us to our seats with barely a greeting, too focused on ensuring everything was perfect for Rachel's special weekend. I looked at the seating chart she was consulting and felt something cold settle in my stomach when I realized where Daniel and I had been placed. The kids' table. I was 32 years old, married, with a career that had taken me to the top of my profession, and my parents had seated me with my teenage cousins, kids ranging from 14 to 17, who spent the entire dinner on their phones or making jokes about their high school drama. Daniel's jaw was tight as we sat down, and he said under his breath, "This is ridiculous, Emma." But I just shook my head slightly because what was the point of making a scene? This was so perfectly representative of how my family saw me that it almost felt like performance art. My cousin Tyler, 16 and more interested in his phone than conversation, asked me what I did for work with the kind of polite disinterest teenagers display toward adult relatives. And when I said I was an architect, he said, "Cool," and immediately returned to his screen. From where I sat, I could see the head table where Rachel presided like royalty, my parents on either side of her and her fiancé Brandon, and I watched my father stand up to give a toast halfway through dinner, his face flushed with wine and happiness, and he said with unmistakable pride in his voice, "To Rachel, our brilliant daughter, who has brought us so much joy and pride throughout her life, we couldn't be happier to see her marry such a wonderful man." And everyone applauded and Rachel beamed, and I felt Daniel's hand find mine under the table and squeeze hard. My father didn't mention me, didn't acknowledge that he had another daughter sitting 20 feet away, didn't even glance in my direction, and I realized that to him in that moment I simply didn't exist, except as an accessory to Rachel's celebration. I caught Aunt Patricia's eye from across the room and saw her watching the whole scene with an expression that looked like disapproval mixed with sadness. And after dinner, when people were mingling over coffee and dessert, I saw her corner my mother near the bar and watched their body language shift from casual to tense, my mother's shoulders going rigid and her smile becoming forced. And though I couldn't hear what they were saying, I knew somehow that Patricia was finally saying something about the disparity she'd learned about, finally breaking the family silence about how differently I'd been treated. And I felt simultaneously grateful and exhausted because I was so tired of needing other people to fight my battles while I sat at the kids' table pretending everything was fine. I didn't witness the conversation between Aunt Patricia and my mother that night at the rehearsal dinner, but Patricia called me the next morning while I was getting coffee in the hotel lobby and told me everything that had been said, her voice carrying a mixture of anger and vindication that made me grip my phone tighter as I listened. She said she'd cornered my mother near the bar after watching my father's toast that completely erased my existence, and she'd asked point blank why I had been charged $500 a month in rent, starting when I was 16 years old, and my mother's face had apparently gone through several expressions before settling on defensive indignation as she said, "We were teaching her responsibility, Patricia. She needed to learn how the real world works." And Patricia had responded with barely concealed contempt. But not Rachel? Rachel didn't need to learn responsibility? And my mother had shifted tactics the way she always did when confronted with the disparity, saying in that tone that suggested the answer should be obvious. Rachel needed more support. She was sensitive. She had a harder time adjusting to things. Emma was always so independent and capable that we knew she could handle it. Patricia told me she'd actually laughed at that, a sharp, bitter sound, and said, "So you punished Emma for being capable by making her childhood harder, while you coddled Rachel for being difficult?" And my mother had bristled at the word punished, insisting that wasn't what they'd done. They'd simply recognized that their daughters had different needs and parented accordingly. That's when Patricia had decided to reveal what she'd learned about my career, and she'd said with deliberate precision, "Patricia mentioned that Emma's doing quite well for herself professionally," and my mother had waved a dismissive hand and said something that made my chest tighten even hearing it secondhand. "Emma exaggerates. You know how she is. She works at some small firm doing residential drawings or something. She's always made things sound more impressive than they are. Patricia said she'd felt her temper snap at that point, and she'd said very clearly, very firmly, "Your daughter is a senior architect at Morrison and Associates, one of the most prestigious firms in the Pacific Northwest. She designed the Portland Civic Center that you drive past, probably every week. It was a $50 million project that won the National Architecture Award and was featured in Architectural Digest. And the fact that you don't know this says everything about how little attention you've paid to her life." Patricia described the silence that followed as excruciating, my mother's face going pale and then flushed, and finally my mother had said in a voice that sounded small and uncertain, "She never told us about any of that." And Patricia had delivered what I knew must have been a devastating response. "She says she's tried to tell you multiple times, but you always change the subject to talk about Rachel. And eventually she stopped trying because what was the point of sharing her life with people who weren't interested in hearing about it?" My mother had apparently stood there for a long moment, her mouth opening and closing, before she'd turned and walked away without another word. And Patricia told me she thought the truth had finally landed, had finally penetrated the willful blindness my parents had maintained for decades, though whether it would change anything remained to be seen. The wedding day arrived with brilliant September sunshine that felt like a deliberate irony, the kind of perfect weather that made everything look beautiful in photographs, regardless of what tensions simmered beneath the surface. And I stood in the bridal suite of the venue helping Rachel with her dress and her veil, and performing all the duties expected of a bridesmaid, while my mind kept replaying Patricia's phone call from that morning and wondering what my mother was thinking after their conversation the night before. The ceremony itself was beautiful. I had to admit that. Held in a garden at the Columbia River Gorge, with mountains in the background and flowers everywhere. And I stood with the other bridesmaids in our matching sage green dresses and watched Rachel marry Brandon, and felt a complicated mixture of emotions that I couldn't entirely untangle. Happiness for her that she'd found someone who loved her, mixed with residual hurt over everything that had led to this moment, and the vast disparity in how our parents had celebrated and supported our respective journeys to marriage. The reception was held at the Sentinel Hotel in downtown Portland, an upscale historic venue with crystal chandeliers and marble floors. Exactly the kind of place Rachel had always dreamed about. And during cocktail hour, while guests mingled with drinks and appetizers, I was standing with Daniel near one of the tall windows when I saw my mother approaching us with an expression I'd never quite seen on her face before. Something uncertain and almost nervous, and she said with awkward formality, "Emma, Patricia mentioned that you're doing well at work?" And I felt Daniel's hand tighten slightly on my arm as I turned to face her and said simply, "I'm doing fine, Mom," keeping my voice neutral because I genuinely didn't know what she wanted from this conversation or how much Patricia had actually told her. She stood there for a moment looking like she wanted to say more, but didn't know how to start. And then she said with that persistent tone that suggested she wasn't going to let this drop, "She said something about a building you designed? Why didn't you tell us about that?" And I felt something cold and tired settle in my chest as I looked at this woman who had dismissed my accomplishments for so long and who now suddenly wanted details because someone else had told her they mattered. And I said quietly, calmly, without anger, but with absolute clarity, "I did tell you, Mom. It was at Christmas 2 years ago. I tried to tell you about the Civic Center project, and you changed the subject after about 30 seconds to talk about Rachel's apartment hunting. You said her granite countertops were so exciting." And I watched her face go through several expressions, confusion and then memory, and then something that might have been shame, though it was hard to tell. She opened her mouth to respond, looked flustered and defensive the way she always did when confronted with something she didn't want to acknowledge, and started to say something about not remembering that, or surely I was mistaken. But Daniel stepped slightly closer to me in a gesture of silent support, and I felt his presence like an anchor, and my mother seemed to recognize that this wasn't a conversation she was going to win right now, not at Rachel's wedding reception with guests all around us, and she said something vague about talking later and drifted away looking unsettled. And I released a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding while Daniel leaned down and whispered, "You handled that perfectly." And I wasn't sure I agreed, but I was proud of myself for finally stating the simple truth without apologizing for it. The reception dinner was everything Rachel had dreamed of, elegant and formal, with carefully arranged seating and elaborate centerpieces, and a meal that probably cost more per plate than I used to make in a week at Mel's Diner. And I sat at my assigned table with Daniel and two of Brandon's cousins I'd never met, and tried to focus on the food and the conversation, and not think about the awkward exchange with my mother during cocktail hour. But then the speeches began, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest as Brandon's best man stood up and told funny stories about their friendship and toasted to their future. And then my father rose with his champagne glass, and I watched him beam at Rachel with such obvious pride and love as he said, "Rachel has always been our joy, from the moment she was born, and watching her grow into this beautiful, accomplished woman has been one of the greatest privileges of my life. And I want to thank her for bringing Brandon into our family." And he went on for several minutes about Rachel's qualities and her achievements, and how he and my mother had given her everything she needed to succeed because they believed in her so completely. And there was no mention of me, not even a passing acknowledgement that he had another daughter sitting 30 feet away. And I felt Daniel's hand find mine under the table and squeeze hard as that familiar sting settled behind my eyes, the one I'd felt so many times over so many years that I should have been numb to it by now, but somehow never was. I thought the speeches were finished, and I was preparing to paste on a smile and applaud when Aunt Patricia suddenly stood up and walked to where the microphone stood, and I saw my mother's face register surprise and then something like alarm as Patricia took the microphone with a smile that looked warm but had steel underneath it, and she said in a clear, carrying voice, "I hope you'll indulge me for just a moment, because I want to make a toast to both of my nieces on this beautiful day." And I felt my stomach drop, because I suddenly knew exactly what she was about to do. And I wanted to stop her because this was Rachel's wedding, and despite everything, I didn't want to create a scene or take attention away from her, but Patricia was already continuing. "To Rachel, on this gorgeous celebration of her marriage, may you and Brandon have every happiness." And then she turned slightly and looked directly at where I was sitting and said with deliberate emphasis, "And to Emma, whose extraordinary success as one of Portland's leading architects makes this entire family so proud, even though we haven't always shown it the way we should." The room went very quiet, and I could feel dozens of pairs of eyes turning toward me as Patricia continued, her voice warm but pointed. "Some of you may not know that Emma designed the new Civic Center downtown, that beautiful building on Fifth Avenue that's been in all the papers, a masterpiece of modern architecture that won the National Architecture Award last year." And there were immediate murmurs of recognition around the room, because apparently many of the guests had seen the building or read about it. And I watched my mother's face go from red to pale as my father looked completely confused. And across the room, I could see Rachel's expression shifting from surprise to something darker, something that looked like annoyance and anger and embarrassment all mixed together. And Patricia raised her glass and said, "To both these remarkable women." And everyone drank, though the atmosphere in the room had changed completely, had gone from celebratory to awkward and tense, and as Patricia returned to her seat, I sat frozen in mine while Daniel squeezed my hand again and leaned close to whisper, "Well, the truth is out now." After Patricia's speech, the atmosphere in the reception hall shifted completely, transformed from celebratory to something awkward and charged with tension, and within minutes, multiple guests began approaching our table with genuine interest and congratulations. People I'd never met or barely knew saying things like, "I had no idea Rachel's sister designed that beautiful building," and "You must be so proud of your work," and "My firm tried to recruit from Morrison and Associates, but they never hire away." And I handled each conversation as gracefully as I could, thanking people politely and deflecting attention back to Rachel and Brandon and the wedding, because despite everything, this was supposed to be Rachel's day, and I genuinely hadn't wanted this spotlight. hadn't wanted Patricia to say anything at all, even though I understood why she had. But I could see across the room that Rachel was not handling this the same way I was, could see her face growing tighter and her smile becoming more forced each time someone glanced my direction or mentioned the Civic Center. And I felt a knot forming in my stomach because I knew exactly what was coming. It happened during a quiet moment when most guests were focused on the cake cutting and Daniel had stepped away to get us drinks. Rachel appeared beside me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said in a low, tight voice, "Could I talk to you for a moment? Privately?" And I followed her out to a quiet corridor near the restrooms where the sounds of the reception faded to a distant murmur. And the moment we were alone, her expression transformed from forced pleasantness to pure fury as she hissed, "You couldn't let me have one day, could you? You had to make it about you and your impressive career and your important building." And I felt something cold settle in my chest as I looked at her. This woman who had been given everything and somehow still resented me for existing, and I said quietly, calmly, without raising my voice, "I didn't say anything, Rachel. I've never said anything. That's the problem." And she made a dismissive gesture with her hand and snapped, "Don't give me that. You told Patricia. You made sure everyone knew you couldn't stand that today was about me." And I felt years of silence and swallowed words rising up in my throat as I said, "Patricia asked about my work. She was the first person in this family to genuinely ask in years. And I answered honestly, that's all. I didn't ask her to make that speech and I didn't want the attention." But Rachel wasn't listening, was already shaking her head and saying, "This is so typical of you, always playing the victim, always acting like you have it so hard." And something in me broke at those words, at the sheer obliviousness and entitlement in them, and I heard myself say with absolute clarity, "What's that supposed to mean?" And Rachel threw her hands up and said, "You know exactly what it means. You've always been jealous of me, always resentful, and now you're trying to ruin my wedding." And I felt a strange calm descend over me as I looked at her and said simply, directly, without anger, but with finality, "It means I'm done being invisible." Rachel stared at me with an expression that mixed confusion and indignation. As I stood there in that quiet corridor with my heart pounding, but my voice steady, and I realized that this moment had been building for 16 years. Building since the first time I handed over that rent check at age 16, while Rachel got to keep every penny she earned from her occasional babysitting jobs. And suddenly all the words I'd swallowed and all the truths I'd avoided and all the hurt I'd carefully packed away came spilling out as I said, "Do you have any idea what it was like to be charged $500 a month in rent when I was 16 years old, working part-time at a diner, trying to save for college?" And Rachel's face showed genuine surprise as she said, "What are you talking about?" And I realized with a shock that cut deep that she actually didn't know, that our parents had never told her about the rent they charged me, that she'd been so wrapped up in her own experience of being their golden child that she'd never noticed or questioned why I was always working, always stressed about money, always unable to do the things she did so easily. And I continued, my voice still calm but gaining strength. I paid them approximately $48,000 in rent between the ages of 16 and 24, every summer break, every time I came home from college, $500 a month like clockwork while you lived there rent-free until you were 26, and even then, they paid your rent at your apartment for 2 years. And Rachel shook her head and said defensively, "Mom and Dad charged you rent because you could handle it. They knew I needed more help. I wasn't as strong as you." And I felt something like bitter laughter trying to escape my throat at the absurdity of that justification as I said, "Rachel, I was 16, working part-time for minimum wage plus tips. How was that easier than helping you in your 20s when you had a college degree that they paid for and a full-time job?" And she had no answer to that, just stood there with her mouth slightly open as I continued, the words flowing now like water through a broken dam. "They paid for your entire college education while I graduated with $60,000 in student loans. They contributed $2,000 to my wedding while they're giving you $50,000 for yours. They paid for your car and your insurance and gave you spending money while I was paying rent and working 2 jobs and trying to figure out why I wasn't good enough. And I watched her face cycle through emotions, confusion giving way to discomfort, giving way to a defensive anger. As she said, "Well, you turned out fine, didn't you? You have your fancy career and your impressive building." And I shook my head and said quietly, "I turned out fine despite them, not because of them. And now Mom calls and expects me to contribute $10,000 to your wedding as if I haven't already paid this family enough, as if I owe you anything after years of being treated like I didn't matter." And Rachel's face flushed red as she snapped, "So that's what this is about, the money. You're just bitter about money." And I looked at her directly and said with absolute clarity, "It was never about the money, Rachel. It was about fairness. It was about being seen. It was about having parents who cared enough to ask about my life instead of spending every conversation talking about yours." And I took a breath and delivered the final truth, the one that needed to be said. "I'm not giving you $10,000. I'm not giving you anything. Consider my presence here today the gift. Because honestly, that's more than I owe you." Rachel's face went pale and then red again as she struggled for a response, and I turned to walk back toward the reception, done with this conversation and done with apologizing for finally telling the truth. The morning after the wedding, my mother called at 8 a.m. and left a voicemail demanding that Daniel and I meet them for breakfast at their house to discuss what happened. And I listened to that message twice before deleting it and calling back to say we would meet them at a neutral location, a quiet cafe downtown at 10 o'clock, because I needed this conversation to happen on my terms and not in the house where I'd spent so many years feeling small and unseen. And when we arrived, my parents were already seated in a corner booth looking uncomfortable and uncertain in a way I'd never seen before. My father's usual confident posture replaced by something hunched and defensive, while my mother's eyes were red-rimmed like she'd been crying. And after we ordered coffee, my father cleared his throat and said, "Emma, we need to understand what happened yesterday. Why you felt it necessary to embarrass your sister and us in front of all those people." And I felt Daniel's hand find mine under the table as I pulled out my laptop and opened the spreadsheet I'd created the night before when I couldn't sleep, turning the screen toward them as I said calmly, "I didn't embarrass anyone. I simply stopped hiding the truth, and I think it's time we all looked at that truth clearly." And they stared at the spreadsheet with its neat columns and undeniable numbers, line items documenting 16 years of financial disparity, rent paid from ages 16 to 24, totaling $48,000, while Rachel paid zero. Their contributions to Rachel's education versus mine showing a $60,000 difference, wedding contributions with a $48,000 gap, car payments and insurance and rent assistance and loans, never expected to be repaid, adding up to approximately $200,000 more invested in Rachel than in me. And I watched my father's face go pale as he scanned the numbers while my mother made a small sound in her throat and said, "Emma, this isn't fair. You can't reduce family to a spreadsheet." And I replied quietly, "You're right, I can't," which is why this was never really about the money, but the money makes the pattern visible in a way that's harder to deny. And my father stammered, "We were trying to teach you responsibility. We thought you were strong enough to handle it." And I leaned forward and said with absolute clarity, "I don't need your money now. I haven't needed it for years. I have a career I'm proud of and financial security I built entirely by myself. But I needed your fairness then. I needed you to see me as equally worthy of support and investment and attention. I needed you to ask about my life and celebrate my achievements and show up when it mattered." And my mother's tears were flowing now as she said, "We didn't know. We didn't realize." And I felt something hard in my chest because part of me wanted to say, "You didn't know. Because you never asked, never paid attention, never cared enough to notice." But instead, I took a breath and said, "I'm establishing boundaries going forward. I'll maintain contact with you, but I expect equal treatment and genuine interest in my life, not just Rachel's. I expect you to acknowledge that the way you treated me was unfair and harmful, And if you can't do those things, then I'll need to create more distance because I've spent too many years trying to earn approval that should have been freely given. And I watched them exchange glances, saw my father nod slowly, while my mother reached across the table toward my hand, though I didn't take hers, and I continued. You need to decide if you want a real relationship with me, one based on mutual respect and genuine care, because I'm done accepting crumbs and pretending everything is fine. And then Daniel and I stood up, left money for the coffee we'd barely touched, and walked out into the bright Portland morning. And I felt lighter than I had in years. Felt like I'd finally set down a burden I'd been carrying since I was 16 years old, and first understood that my parents' love came with conditions I could never quite meet. 3 months passed before I heard from them again beyond brief, awkward text messages, and I'd made peace with the possibility that they might choose their comfortable narrative over the harder work of real change. But then an invitation arrived in the mail to my project unveiling, the Civic Center's official opening ceremony. And when I arrived at the event, I was shocked to see both my parents standing near the entrance, looking uncertain and out of place. My mother holding a bouquet of flowers, and my father wearing a suit he'd clearly purchased specifically for this occasion. And during my speech about the design philosophy and community impact, I saw them in the audience actually listening, actually present. And afterward, my mother approached me with tears in her eyes and said simply, I'm sorry, Emma. I'm so sorry we didn't see you. And handed me an envelope that I opened later to find a 6-page handwritten letter acknowledging specific instances of favoritism and dismissal, not making excuses but taking responsibility, promising to do better and asking if I would be willing to try rebuilding our relationship slowly, on my terms. And I won't pretend that letter fixed everything or erased years of hurt, but it was a beginning. And over the following months, they made consistent small efforts, weekly calls where they asked about my work and actually listened to the answers, attendance at my presentations and celebrations, acknowledgement when I mentioned past pain instead of defensiveness or deflection, and I found myself gradually, cautiously opening the door I'd closed. Not because I needed their approval anymore, but because I'd finally learned that my worth wasn't determined by their recognition, which paradoxically made their growing respect more meaningful, made it possible to accept their imperfect attempts at change without requiring perfection. And when I look back now on that morning in the cafe, when I laid out the truth in undeniable numbers and clear words, I realized that was the moment I stopped being the invisible daughter and became simply myself, fully seen at last. And while the relationship with my parents will probably never be what I once desperately wanted it to be, it's becoming something real and honest, built on truth rather than the fiction we all pretended to believe, and that feels like its own kind of peace.